What's up, Guardians, and welcome back, Warlocks. I'm Profane. Thanks for checking out the video. Ionic Sentries are the newest addition to the Stormcaller arsenal, and today we'll be going over the best way to build around this powerful new ability. So we'll be checking out the best exotics, the best weapons, the best artifact mods, and the best class tree options that you'll need to use to have the most success when using Ionic Sentry. This new aspect grants Stormcallers with a stationary turret that's activated through the use of a secondary grenade charge, but don't let this get confused for Arc Souls. That's a completely separate ability, and it's something that we can even integrate into this build. Ionic Sentry works a lot like Gunpowder Gamble. As you defeat enemies with arc weapons, arc abilities, or kinetic weapons, you'll build up stacks of Ionic Sentry, and once it's fully charged, you'll have a second grenade option that's going to temporarily take over your primary grenade option. After it's been thrown and lands, the Sentry's going to send out a burst of energy that's going to blind any nearby enemy, and that's going to take those enemies out of combat for several seconds. Once our Sentry lands, it'll start targeting nearby enemies, pumping them full of arc energy. This will inflict 1 tick of damage per second, and that's going to register for just over 200 points of base damage. This expands on Stormcaller's efficiency towards handling large groups of enemies, and even champions, as this will improve our performance against Overload and unstoppable champs. Each time the Sentry hits a target, a stack of bolt charges will be granted. Bolt charges are another new ability, and this works a lot like Ignitions with solar energies. Bolt charges are like giant lightning strikes that come down over top of enemies. They deal about the same amount of damage as an Ignition, but the effects are much more localized. You will need to have an aspect, fragment, or artifact mod that grants bolt charges, and as you deal damage with arc weapons and abilities, you're going to build up bolt charge stacks. Once it's reached 10, you'll be able to release that bolt charge whenever using your grenade, melee, or super. These can also be triggered by Ionic Sentries, Arc Souls, and even weapon perks like Chain Reaction, Firefly, Volt Shot, and Jolting Feedback. With 2 fresh new abilities added into our arsenal, along with a ton of powerful artifact mods, we're able to see the Stormcaller subclass excel like never before, and there's honestly a lot of great exotic combinations that you could create. The Geomag Stabilizers and Crown of Tempest are some great options right now, and I've mentioned these in previous videos. The Getaway Artist is also a strong option, but it's one that I would reserve more towards prismatic builds. The one exotic that I think has benefited the most from all of these additions, and the exotic that I think will pair up the best with Ionic Sentry, will be the Vesper of Radius. This exotic comes with a Planetary Torrent intrinsic trait, which provides us with a number of benefits. When we're surrounded by enemies, we'll gain a bonus to the regeneration rate of our class ability. This starts as a 250% increase whenever we have 3 enemies nearby, but it's going to max out at 1500% whenever there's 6 enemies nearby. And that's going to give us access to healing rifts at a much more consistent rate, which will definitely help out because Stormcallers are not known for having a large arsenal of healing components. When you activate your class ability, you will trigger a Shockwave that damages all nearby enemies for around 400 points of base damage, which is about half the amount of damage that you would deal with a grenade. This Shockwave blinds enemies, which means you could use this as a defensive strategy to slow down aggressive enemies, but you could also take it on the offensive. Push up into a group of enemies, drop the rift down, get everyone blinded, and then go to town with your weapons and overcharged abilities. After the initial shockwave, you'll see additional bursts get triggered every 5 seconds, which means you're going to get 3 total shockwaves out of each rift. Enemies who are defeated by the shockwave will create their own explosion that deals out 200 points of base damage, which is equivalent to what Firefly does. And because we are using this with the Stormcaller subclass, all of these explosions and the shockwaves will blind enemies. So not only do we have our Ionic Sentry taking enemies out of combat for us, but our Rift is going to do that too. Blinded enemies can't fight back for 10 seconds, which is the best kind of enemy to go up against. And that's the balancing point for this build. We might not have the healing resources that a Solar or Void build would have, but we have a large arsenal of powerful abilities that can subdue and obliterate enemies. With that said, let's take a look at our class tree and see how we've got our aspects, abilities, and fragments set up. We're going with a double dragon special on this build, so we are pairing Ionic Sentry up with Arc Souls, so that we get 2 turrets to mow down enemies with. Some of you might be concerned about not using Electrostatic Mind. This creates ionic traces whenever we defeat jolted and blinded enemies, something we could do with Spark of Ions, but this also grants us with the Amplified buff, which gives us a 15% bonus in damage resistance, but we don't really need that aspect to get Amplified. It makes it easier, but all we really need to do to become Amplified is rapidly defeat enemies with arc abilities and arc weapons. With 2 different turrets lighting up our enemies, we won't really have a problem staying amplified as long as we're in combat. There's also artifact mods like Flashover, which will make us amplified whenever we get maximum stacks of bolt charges. And if we really needed to, we could turn to the Xtheris exotic grenade launcher, which grants amplified on final blows. That would also make a great option because it blinds enemies. When it comes to fragments, we are using Spark of Ions. This will create ionic traces whenever we defeat jolted targets, and whenever we defeat enemies with bolt charges. Ionic traces will grant us with 12.5% bonus melee and grenade energy, and 15% bonus class ability energy, so making a lot of ionic traces will keep all of our abilities charged up and ready. We've got Spark of Amplitude active, so that way we'll create orbs of power whenever we rapidly defeat enemies. This is going to help us and allies regain super energy faster, and it's going to help maintain the effects of weapon surge mods. Orbs of power will also be important to us because this will be our source of health regeneration. We are using the recuperation boots mod, so whenever we collect an orb, we'll gain 70 points of health. So the more orbs that we can create, the more durable we will become. And we have some additional ways of creating orbs through the use of the Reaper class item mod, the Firepower gloves mod, and Siphon helmet mod. We've got Spark of Instinct active, so whenever we become critically wounded, taking damage will emit shockwaves of energy that damage and jolt nearby enemies. This would really come in handy whenever you're getting ran up on by aggressive enemies, like a big Overload Minotaur. This really pairs up well with Vesper of Radius, because our Rift is already going to be sending out shockwaves that are going to blind enemies, so now we're going to be able to jolt them too. The final fragment that we're using is Spark of Resistance, which does exactly what it says. When we are surrounded by enemies, this will provide us with a 15% bonus in damage resistance, and that will stack on top of the bonus that we receive from Amplified. It's not the same level of survivability that we would see out of other builds, but it's still going to be a great help whenever we get swamped. Before we dig into the best weapons to use with this build, I want to take a look into the best artifact mods that we should be using. Along with a focus towards arc abilities, we do have several mods that are oriented towards strand, but we need to remember that we're only going to build up bolt charges with arc, and we're only going to be able to build up stacks of Ionic Sentry with arc and kinetic. So if we do take advantage of any strand artifact mods, it's only going to be to improve our choices in heavy weapon. We're using the Dielectric mod, which will grant additional stacks of bolt charges as we defeat enemies who are under the effects of jolt or blind. With the boosted version of this mod, we'll gain additional orbs of power and bonus health restoration, which is something that this build could really benefit from. As we mentioned before, we do have Flashover active. Not only does this give us amplified, but it's also going to give all of our bolt charges a 150% increase in damage. If we're using a heavy machine gun like the Thunderlord, the 21% Delirium, or the new one from the Dreadnought, then we should be using Hold the Line, which is going to give us bonus health restoration after defeating enemies with machine guns. And with heavy ordnance regeneration, we would gain bonus damage resistance whenever using those heavy machine guns. But if we were to load up with fusion rifles, then I would recommend to use particle reconstruction. This way our fusion rifles would gain automatic reloads and bonus damage whenever applying sustained damage onto a single target. The last standout artifact mod is Defibrillating Blast, which will only be relevant whenever champions are present. Whenever we stun a champion, we'll gain a full stack of bolt charges. A bolt charge will get triggered, and all nearby enemies will become jolted. We're also going to gain around 55 points of health in the process, giving us another way to make up for what this build lacks in health resources. With our artifact providing us with a ton of ways to regain health and resist damage, getting added in with our double turrets and ability to jolt and blind everything, we're going to be a much more efficient Stormcaller in in-game level content, which is not something that we've seen a lot here in Destiny. With that said, let's go ahead and move over to our coveted selection of legendary and exotic weapons. My preferred loadout options include the No Time to Explain, which would give us a third autonomous turret. The Risk Runner is a great option whenever facing a lot of arc damage, since it does create an overshield around you, and it shoots lightning damage through nearby enemies. That's also what makes the Anarchy so great. You can lob a few shots on the ground and watch the fireworks go. The Anarchy would make a great combo to go with our Ionic Sentry and our Shockwave Rift. The Centrifuge and Trinity Ghoul would both fit in nicely with this build to give us some extra crowd control clearance. If we're trying to account for champions, then the Wishender, the Revision Zero, and Bastion would make for some great kinetic options, with the Thunderlord and Queenbreaker making great heavy options. Legendary weapons with Volt Shot and Jolting Feedback will be great options to include into this build, making weapons like the VS Pyroelectric or the Vantage Point very powerful options for us. The Indebted Kindness is one of the most versatile legendary options that we could use. Sidearms gain the ability to pierce barrier champion shields right now, and with Volt Shot active, this would also be able to stun overload champions. If we were to take Spark of Instinct off and put Spark of Beacons on, we would even be able to stun unstoppable champions with it too, so it's possible that we could handle all 3 champions with just one rocket sidearm. The Psycho Pump is the new area denial grenade launcher available through the new Heresy activities, and it does offer the new Rolling Storm weapon trait. This would help us build up bolt charges much faster, and it's going to be easy to build up bolt charges and Ionic Sentry charges with an area denial grenade launcher at hand. It might only be because of the new artifact mods, but Stormcallers have seen a massive upgrade here in Heresy, and this Vesper of Radius build lets us hone in on those strengths, giving us a powerful build to subdue and obliterate targets with. So if you haven't checked out this exotic with a new look of the Stormcaller, then it's time you do so. With that said, we've come to an end of today's build video, but if you do need help getting this build set up for yourself, then be sure to visit my Mobalytics or dim links that are down in the description below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Ionic Sentries, Bolt Charges, and the Vesper of Radius, so let us know what you think down in the comments below, and let us know what builds you've been rocking out so far here in Heresy. Thank you as always for checking out the video. If you enjoyed and found it helpful, then be sure to hit that like button below, along with the subscribe button if you're new. Both are greatly appreciated, and both really do help support the channel. And until next time, Guardians, this has been Profane, wishing you all some happy hunting.